Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
For more than a century, an invasive species has been literally sucking the life out of the Great Lakes. They're known as sea lampreys. After nearly decimating commercial fishing operations in the early 20th century, a management program was created to keep the lampreys at bay. And it's been successful. The numbers of sea lampreys have been reduced by 90% since the program first began. But the work has been ongoing, and now cuts to the federal program are threatening that progress. Journalist Katie Thornton tagged along with some of the people doing this work, and wrote about it for The New Yorker. She joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers, along with Mark Gaden, the executive secretary of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, whose work was featured in the piece.
How would you describe a lamprey?
It's an exotic species, an invasive species, and it's long and snake-like, looks like an eel. It's not an eel, but it looks like one. Completely cartilaginous, so no bones. It doesn't have a jaw, but it has an alien-like suction cup mouth that's ringed with hundreds of teeth, and then a sharp razor-like drill tongue in the middle. So when the lamprey attaches to a fish, the tongue will flick out, drill through the scales and skin of the fish, and feed off of the fish's blood and body fluids. So it's very much something out of a horror movie. Probably Halloween is its favorite time of year because the lamprey are just, something that only a mother could love.
They're quite frightening looking. The mouth is definitely this sort of the culmination of all the things that are fearful about the fish and fearsome about the fish. I mean, it really is just over 100 teeth in these sort of concentric circles within the mouth of this fish. And, over the course of my reporting on the Sea Lamprey Control Program, I had an opportunity to latch one onto my hand. And, it was something I am very grateful to do once, and to feel the sheer sort of power of these fish. They suction onto the fish at a power that's, 4 times as powerful as a normal vacuum. They suction onto the fish.
You're a fish. You're not going to have a lot of luck shaking it off, frankly. And you had to break the seal, right? I mean, to actually get the lamprey off of you. Again, it's not feeding. It's just grabbing onto something to keep from wriggling onto the ground.
Right.
But if you leave it on a little bit too long, it'll leave quite a mark, put it that way. But it's more because the suction cup mouth is just digging and pulling harder toward your skin there. And you literally need to break the seal. And sometimes you can't break it fast enough. You're like,
Yeah, you need a thumb to do that. You need to really pinch the mouth of the lamprey to get it off of you, which a fish doesn't have that benefit.
No.
I definitely showed a picture of lamprey to my colleagues when pitching this story. Everyone in the room, not a squeamish bunch, very, very terrified of this little animal. These, of course, are invasive lamprey in the Great Lakes that we're talking about. How did they first end up in the Great Lakes system?
They made their way in through man-made shipping canals, so they swam their way into the Great Lakes. They're native to the Atlantic Ocean, and the first conduit into the Great Lakes was the Erie Canal, celebrating an anniversary, actually. It was one of the greatest engineering feats of its time, and it connected the Hudson River in New York to Buffalo and went through northern New York. The Erie Canal was the pathway for these species. The lamprey made it past Niagara Falls about 1920 and had free access to the rest of the Great Lakes Basin. Swam their way into Lakes Huron and Michigan about 1935, 1936, and were seen finally in Lake Superior by 1939. And they spawn in streams. There are abundant streams throughout the Great Lakes Basin that are perfect lamprey spawning habitat. And then they're not all that picky about the fish that they eat either. So it was an open buffet, all the spawning you want, just a recipe for disaster.
Well, and it seems that's exactly what happened, a bit of a disaster. What were the conditions like in the Great Lakes that really spawned this program, pun not intended, to eradicate them from the Great Lakes?
Well, when the lampreys invaded, the fishery was actually already on the ropes. So it was the late 1800s when surveys between Canada and the United States were beginning to catalog the decline of the fishery. So human activity since the time of European colonization was pretty intense when it comes to the fisheries. By the late 1800s, it was an overly industrialized commercial fishing operation. You had more and more intensively lethal gear that the fishers were using, the ability through transportation networks to ship the product to farther and farther locations, and pollution. We started seeing pollution coating fish spawning reefs like sawdust from the lumbering industry, as an example. And the scientists at the time were documenting a significant decline in some of the species that were the mainstay of commercial fishing, lake trout and sturgeon, whitefish. Atlantic salmon was the first to go. Was native to Lake Ontario. And the state of the fishery was pretty dire. But the lamprey was the proverbial kind of straw that broke the camel's back. It was a stressed fishery to begin with, and this was just adding fuel to the fire. The lamprey, each one will kill about 40 pounds of Great Lakes fish. So when you already have a stressed fishery, adding that pressure to it was more than the fishery could bear.
Yeah, I believe there was a stat in Dan Egan's book that said the trout harvest in Lake Michigan alone went from 6 million pounds, which, as Mark said, was already taxed from previous years, from 6 million pounds in 1944 to zero in 1954, due largely to the lampreys.
Now, this is a complicated problem, as you mentioned, Mark, for a variety of reasons, one of them being that the Great Lakes are international waters. This is an issue that has to be addressed by both the United States and Canada. But these two countries have come together in some ways to really address this issue. Can you tell us a bit about your organization, Mark?
For most of the history of the Great Lakes from the time of European settlement, there was actually very little coordination across those borders. So the fishery was something that attracted Europeans to the Great Lakes Basin. People could make a living just like they could from agriculture, but fisheries was something that attracted people. And yet no two jurisdictions, think Ontario and Michigan or Michigan and Wisconsin, had the same regulations and very often not even the same philosophy. Ontario might say, if we have problems with the fishery, why don't we just regulate? And Michigan might say, why don't we build some hatcheries? And you'd have just very different ideas about that. When they were talking about the state of the fishery leading to kind of the mid 20th century, there was still very little cooperation across borders. The sea lamprey then, when it invaded, it actually was managed in the early days very similarly to how any other fish species would be. And that is Michigan would kind of do its thing, and Ontario its thing, and Pennsylvania its thing. The jurisdictions tried to control the lampreys, but it's a basin-wide problem. And if Michigan manages to keep them out of one river, they'll just swim over to Ontario. They don't observe the political boundaries. And the sum of the parts was not leading to anything effective. That's why they needed a fishery commission like ours to tackle these common problems from a unified way. There would have been no way to deal with lamprey control had Canada and the U.S. not come together to tackle that, what really was an existential threat.
This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers, and I'm speaking right now with Mark Gaden. He's the Executive Secretary of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. We're also joined by journalist Katie Thornton, who wrote about the ongoing efforts to remove invasive sea lampreys from the Great Lakes. Katie, your story was very descriptive of the messy work that is lamprey removal. Can you tell us a bit about that, what that looks like on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. For this story in the New Yorker, I had the opportunity to get out with some of these crews who are doing the on-the-ground work of controlling the lamprey population, of rooting out the invasive sea lampreys. And it is a very involved process. I mean, so often I think we hear about federal workers or federal programs, and we don't necessarily know, if you haven't seen it firsthand, you don't necessarily know what it takes to do this work that gets so easily sort of summed up or mentioned in passing. Controlling the sea lamprey is a massive, massive project. As Mark mentioned, they spawn in streams. And so these crews who, are made up of both US and Canadian federal workers. These crews are getting out in everything from tiny sort of highway side trickles to massive urban river systems. And there's multiple ways that the sea lamprey population are controlled, but the main part of the operation is a lampricide, a very highly selective pesticide that has minimal effects on other fish and does a very good job of killing the sea lamprey and sort of leaving the rest of the ecosystem intact. Mark could talk about this with much greater detail, but it was discovered at a lab in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula of Michigan in the 1950s after years and years of trial and error trying to find a chemical compound that would kill the lampreys without killing the surrounding ecosystems. And eventually that was discovered and put into place. And it was effective quite quickly, within 2 decades of beginning to do these treatments in these streams, the fishery was really coming back to life. And so when I learned about this process, I really wanted to see what does that look like in practice. It takes a lot of highly specialized labor. You have folks who have pesticide application licenses. It requires round-the-clock application and monitoring. You have to hit the stream with a very specific concentration of this toxin for 9 straight hours. You can't go under or it won't be lethal to the lamprey. You can't go over the concentration or it might run the risk of hurting other things. And so there's a lot of very specific application, monitoring, a lot of physical work, getting in the water, wading into the rapids, collecting samples, bringing it back to these sort of mobile chemistry labs that are set up in trailers around the area, monitoring the concentration, and a lot of planning as well. These river systems are intricate, they're snaking, you have multiple tributaries flowing to a main stream. You have to sort of hit them all at a very specific time. It's almost like a game of Pac-Man. You have to sort of flood the lampreys in every avenue they could go so that they don't just scurry into another stream and avoid the toxin. And it really is, it's a very highly strategic, highly coordinated, very labor-intensive effort. I was out on an overnight shift with some of these folks who were applying the lampricide, as it's called, and I very quickly noticed there's not so much as a camp chair, in these labor sites. It's really, there's no opportunity to even really sit down.
It does seem like it's very involved work that involves a lot of expertise. One of the elements of your story, of course, is about funding, and we'll get to that in a minute. But who are the people who are doing this work? Who are the kinds of people who are capable of doing this work?
Some of these people have been part of the program for many, many years. It's a very effective, as Katie noted, in what they do. And these people are extremely dedicated to the work that they do. They're aware that the lampricide applications and the sea lamprey control program is the mainstay of the fishery. And they're very proud of the fact that if they didn't do what they were doing, we would have no fishery to speak of. And in fact, COVID, where the lamprey control, which again, as Katie said, out in the field and labor intensive, where it was curtailed for a couple of years because of travel restrictions, the lampreys bounced back very, very quickly. We just published a paper that demonstrated really how quickly they bounce back. It's like a coiled spring. As long as you keep your thumb on it, you're going to be fine. But if you take your foot off the gas, they're going to spring back pretty fast and pretty uncontrolled, to mix metaphors there. These are people who are highly trained. As Katie said, they have a license to do what they do. Some of them as well just have deep expert knowledge, like they know these streams like the back of their hand, and can apply that deep knowledge to what they do. It is effective. What they do is reduce the lamprey populations by about 95% throughout the Great Lakes Basin, and probably exceeded the expectations wildly of the people who put this program into motion in the mid-1950s. Katie spent a few days with the crews. I've spent almost 30 years working in this program, and I still never cease to be amazed how dedicated these people are and really how effective they are. What a relatively small amount of people, by the way. You're talking about maybe 40 people who contribute to a $5.5 billion Great Lakes fishery. It's amazing.
Katie, as with many things in our nation today, the federal government is slashing funding for many of the people involved in this work. What is that looking like right now? What is the funding looking like right now?
Sure. I was interested in the sea lamprey control program just as somebody who lives in a Great Lakes state, as somebody who grew up in a Great Lakes state. And earlier this year, after what has come to be known in federal worker circles as the Valentine's Day Massacre, when many federal workers were laid off unceremoniously, the lamprey program was among the programs that initially got hit. They weren't able to hire seasonal workers due to a government-wide hiring freeze, and seasonal workers are sort of the backbone of the treatment program. And there were layoffs of probationary workers, as there were in multiple different government agencies. The Fisheries Commission and others and constituents in the Great Lakes state were ultimately able to get a lot of that funding back, which is a really remarkably impressive feat. It perked my ears up at the beginning of this year, wondering what happens when you do sort of cut these programs. It's easy to see a headline that says different federal workers, these different federal programs have been cut. I really wanted to know what that looks like on the ground. Thankfully, the lamprey control program was able to restaff. With some delays and some scaling back, they were able to get out there and treat this season, which is really important because what was learned during COVID was that if you roll back these programs for even just a season, these invasive species that tank economies, that dramatically alter fisheries, they come roaring back very, very quickly. And maybe I'll let Mark talk a little bit more about the sort of ongoing funding.
Yeah, it's been a rough year for sure. And that's for all the things Katie said, it was personnel issues. And again, these are highly trained people who are specialized. So if they are not hired, the seasonals in the first place, or if we have people taking the early outs that were offered to federal employees or just outright fired, it becomes a problem because we rely on that expertise and that very specialized work of these people to do what we do. It turned out not to be as much of a money issue as it turned out to be a staffing issue. And a lot of the people that we relied upon to do this took the retirements or were encouraged to leave their jobs. We lost probably about 350 years of combined experience by people who were kind of late career that took the offers that the administration offered. And as we go into 2026, we kind of managed to pace together enough crews to do the work in 2025, which was very good. In 2026 going forward, we still have unanswered questions about the gaps in the program, given the loss of personnel that we've had. The president's budget included full funding for the sea lamprey control program, and Congress has provided, for what we've seen so far, full funding for the control program. And we had members of Congress from both parties very, very supportive, and that was very heartening. They went to bat, talked to the Interior Secretary, talked to the powers that be, and really did a lot of work to help so that we didn't have a gap in the control program. I'm cautiously optimistic, given the funding that's been provided, that we'll continue to see that political support and be able to move forward in 2026 fully staffed. But there's still a lot of work to do and a lot of unknowns.
We will see what the future holds for the lamprey and the Great Lakes. Katie, Mark, thank you both so much for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us, Joy.
Mark Gaden is the Executive Secretary of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Katie Thornton is a Peabody Award-winning journalist whose piece on sea lamprey was recently featured in The New Yorker. They both joined Lake Effect's Joy Powers.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.